Alrighty, so now that we have our canvas all ready, we're gonna do some acrylic painting techniques. It's gonna be awesome. I'm using a painting pad. It's basically chunks of canvas that are primed and glued into a book. It's pretty cool. All right, we're just gonna jump right in. I have these lists. I have the list of techniques on my class materials website. So if you need that, just give me a holler. And the one that we start with is dry brush. Oh, I did need a shirt, which I tossed away, of course. All right, so the first one, I'm gonna write them down here and then do this demo. First one we got is dry brush. Dry brush is super simple. It is exactly what you think it is. You have a brush, it is dry. You dip it in your paint and you go at it. You paint. That's pretty much it. It's just a way, it's not the way I'm brushing, it's simply the description of using pure paint with nothing added. Other times we might add mediums or paint, other paints or water or whatever, but dry brush is what it is. It's just paint, brush, straight to the canvas. This is useful to know when I try to describe other techniques. That might include saying, hey, to blend this, you might want to try a dry brushing method, that kind of thing. Or hey, to get this texture of the canvas to show up, try dry brushing it, that kind of thing. So that's pretty much it for the first one. Sgraffito is next. Sgraffito is a fancy schmancy way of saying scratching into the paint to reveal the surface underneath. So in this case, I'm gonna grab some red. Can't see my whole palette here, but it's there. And I'm just gonna make a random shape. Boop, 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 boop. And the sgraffito part comes in when you flip your brush around and do a cool shape, like a pencil. It's nice if you have a different color already painted and dried underneath. You might get a cool effect. If you don't, that's fine too. Sgraffito is just the description of scraping into your paint to reveal a different color underneath. Next is wet on wet. If you're a watercolorist, you're familiar with this. First you get your brush. Well, I have water off to the side here. It's probably gonna, with my trusty brush tub, get some water and then just put it on there. So now we have the wet part. And then the second wet part is when we get some color. So I'm gonna dip my brush in the water first. Gonna grab some yellow, dip it in the water again. I wanna make sure the paint that I'm putting in is quite watery. Hence wet on wet. So I'd say it's like a drippy color. So it's like almost mostly water. So that when I go onto here, onto my little wet spot here, it's going to make like a pooling effect. I want to zoom in, but I think I've made it so that I can't do that right now. Basically, when you do this, it creates this neat effect where the wet color will travel around only inside the first wet spot you put in. See that? It's kind of staying where we put the water in the first part. So this gets more interesting when you add more than one color, I'd say. So right now we just have the one. I'm gonna grab a contrasting color, possibly some, I don't know, blue. Again, you have to make sure it's quite hydrated or else it's not gonna move around. If you just plop a thing of dry paint in the middle there, it might not react the same way, but you know, give it a try if you want. And then, boop, watch it go. Look at it go, it travels around. It's pretty cool. Again, I am not a huge fan of this because I like control. I'm bit of a control freak when it comes to my painting. I like to have it so that I can predict where my colors are gonna go. If you're more experimental, oopsies, here we go. If you like playing around, getting cool textures, getting some movement, this is really similar to the acrylic pouring method in like a really controlled environment kind of. So you can move it around. Wet on wet is a lot of fun if you want to play with your colors. The next technique we have is very similar. We have, actually in my list here, what did I do after wet on wet? Oh, I did wet on dry after that. Okay, we'll wait till we'll do the next one after. We will do underpainting. I also have it listed in my materials as wet on dry. So this method is not so much a way to paint as a way to plan a painting. So what I might do is, let's say I'm starting a brand new painting, a giant canvas, and I'm planning on using the most beautiful, expensive paints, like my nicest ones. I just got a new set of like golden acrylics and I want to make it awesome, but hey, I'm still in the sketchy stages of my painting skills and I don't want to use my best paints right off the bat. So what I'm going to do is an underpainting. An underpainting is when you can use kind of any color, maybe a color you want if you want your whole painting kind of to have a reddish tone, or if you want your work to be influenced by the base color. But basically an underpainting is like a sketch layer. Think of it as your rough copy. Let's do a little house here. We have to let this dry though. So the underpainting is going to be the underlayer. And then later on, we go over it with our actual colors, with the rendering, with the lighting, with the shading, that kind of thing. But for now, we're gonna let that dry. Underpaintings are just that. We'll go over it a little bit after, but it has to dry first. Glazing. Glazing is a method where, let's see, you start by laying down a dark color and then let it dry. And then you overlay or glaze a lighter wash on top progressively in stages. Again, we're gonna have to do an initial layer first. Let's pick one of my more drier colors. Maybe we'll make a nice purple. My palette is a mess. I use it all the time for all sorts of different classes and for fun. Sometimes when I just want to touch something up, I see whatever colors I have. So for glazing, I'm just going to first do this little swatch. A swatch is a fancy word for a sample of color. There, and we're gonna let it dry, okay? We can't glaze it until the bottom layer is kind of more dry. I mean, you probably can, but I prefer to show the effects of it once it's dried for a little bit. We'll skip on to the next one while it dries. Next, I have impasto. Impasto is a super schmancy, fancy way of saying we're gonna use a palette knife. Hey, now guess what? In my personal painting practice, I never use a palette knife. Almost never. I use a palette knife to mix colors on my palette sometimes, but usually I just use brushes. So today we have a very fancy oyster shucking knife because my palette knife is at my studio and not in my office. And to record these videos, I have to be in my office. So here we go. We're gonna use impasto. Impasto is just the fancy word to describe using a palette knife instead of a brush. Now, why would you do this? Beats me. I hate using it. But some artists paint entirely with palette knives instead of brushes. And what it does is it enables you to get some of these really cool textures and control. You can do sharp edges with a palette knife. You can get really interesting line work that you could not get with some brushes. You can also scrape into your canvas as well, doing a bit of a sgraffito effect. But the idea for this one is that you're using a tool instead of a brush to apply paint in a textured manner. That's my fancy way of saying it. You can even use an oyster shucking knife. Ta-da! Okay, impasto is easy peasy. I rarely ever do it because I'm not a textury painter personally, but to each their own. Modeling paste, again, another one I'm not really familiar with. Rather, it's not that I'm unfamiliar with it. I've seen it a bunch, but it's not something I normally use. Modeling paste can be found at any store that sells paint supplies, fine art supplies. You probably won't find it at the dollar store or anything, but this one I got at Michael's, but they also have it at our every other local art supplier place that I have nearby. It basically just looks like mud for walls, you know, like for drywall. I'm going to use my trusty knife again. Now, why would you use this? It doesn't have a color. What is it even? Basically, if you ever go to a museum, check out some of the paintings, especially, well, some of the oil paintings where the paint is applied really thickly, or even acrylics or mixed media pieces. Modeling paste is a really cool way to get texture without using paint to get those bumps. So modeling paste is used to simulate texture. You can build up the texture with a palette knife or a brush or your fingers or whatever, a spoon, whatever you want. And then you have to let it dry. Again, we're stuck waiting for something to dry to see the effects. But what it does is it creates this really cool 3D landscape for you to then add paint on after. And sometimes when you're using acrylics, they can be, again, paint is expensive, right? It's not a renewable resource. It needs to be used sparingly sometimes. If you want to create this awesome texture without using all the paint like we did in impasto, using the modeling paste helps create these textures without using paint to make those textures. It dries a little faster than maybe a pure blob of paint. And then once it dries, you can paint over it and it'll keep its texture. Well, it should. We're gonna have to wait for that one to dry too. So let's skip on to the next one. Medium. A medium is anything you use along with your paint to assist in the flow of your paint. So what it does, it also slows the drying time. This is a matte medium by Liquitex. I have used all sorts of mediums before. I've used gel medium or gloss medium. They have a whole bunch. They have, so yeah, like different thicknesses, different fluids. So this one is nice because it actually has a little gauge on the side. Not all of them may not have this, but basically it shows you where it is on the scale. So when you would use this, you wouldn't use it in prepping, you would use it while painting and not while finishing. So during painting, it's more of a matte texture and less of a glossy texture. And here it's more fluid than thick, and it's more transparent than opaque. You can find different mediums that act all sorts of ways. Basically, this one, when combined with your paint, creates a matte, non-reflective finish. It's opaque when wet, dries translucent and matte. It increases the translucency. Basically, it's a liquid that you can add to any of your colors to change how they react on the canvas. Typically, I only use it when I want to kind of water down a color or make it more workable. And when I say workable, I mean like flexible or a little watered down without actually using water. So how you use it, you can just put it right in your palette. My palette's really dirty right now, but there it is right there. It looks white, but it'll dry clear, okay? And then I'm gonna mix it with a different color, like our red here. Grab a blob of red, mix it in with my medium. It lightens it, but it doesn't affect the color too much. it shouldn't affect the color at all, actually. What it'll do is just make it more liquidy, easier to manipulate, and it'll make it a little more transparent on your canvas. So here I'm gonna do a little bit with the medium. Again, the more you paint, the more you'll realize, you'll see what things work better with your personal techniques. I'm showing you what they are so that you know what they are when you go to the store and see them, but it's not something you need, okay? I've painted for years and years and years, never needed medium ever before, okay? So it's not something you actually super need. So I'm gonna do a little blob of non-medium paint right next to the medium paint. You can see the difference that way, especially once it dries. I'm gonna do a little bit of a transition here. So it goes from no medium to medium. And by medium, I mean it's a thing. It's like a vessel for your paint. Okay. So those are different mediums. And again, you can try different ones. Some of them are glossy, some of them are matte, some of them are thicker or thinner. It basically just means it's a way, like a thing, to extend or work with your paint to change its properties. Okay, what do we got next? Sponging. So sponging is pretty basic. You probably have seen people do it all the time in like decorating shows. They might have a sponge that they use for texture. That's basically all it is. I have a random sponge that I think was taken off of a brush at some point. And basically it's just that. You might want to do a large area at a time, and that's when this sponge would come in handy. You just apply paint on there and then go for it. Do it lightly, and you should get some cool textures. You can also push the paint around with the sponge, but the idea is that you're creating a fun texture. This would also be good on a really big canvas. You can use it for for leaves, for trees. You can use it for anything you want to add a little extra texture to. They also have sponges that are like natural sea sponges that have really beautiful textures, like full of bubbles and stuff. So, you know, keep an eye out for cool ways to make shortcuts to do different textures. Because otherwise, if you were looking at doing a painting and you wanted to get this kind of texture, but you didn't know how, or you thought you had to use a brush all the time, you don't. You can use whatever you want. So instead of actually, you know, using your brush to make all these little dots and whatever, you can just use a sponge or whatever you want. Next, we're gonna do drips and splatters. Now this is fun. Whenever I teach kids, this is their favorite thing to do. We kind of already touched on it with the wet on wet. And our wet on wet is probably gonna travel as soon as I lift this canvas, but that's okay. We'll get some cool textures. The drips and splatters, first we'll cover drips. Drips, again, you want water first. I have my water bucket over here. Water, and what color have we not used in a bit? We'll use the yellow again. Maybe we'll make some cool green. The drips really is just a way of loading up your paintbrush with lots of watery paint. We're gonna tilt it, and we're going to, on purpose, let the paint travel. Now I'm just worried about my wet on wet, so I might actually soak that up a bit so it doesn't travel too much. This canvas paper is not very absorbent, so. All right, so the drips are simply like that. You can push your brush a little bit to get a drip. Whoop, there it goes. Get them going. But drips are just intentionally when you're trying to create that look. Sometimes you might have an easel that can be propped up or down, and that really helps if you're doing drips and splatters. No one ever said you had to always paint on an easel or had to always paint on a table. You can be painting. I've seen painters who carry their canvases and flip it upside down and like get the drips to go in all directions. You might have a rotating table and pour it in the middle and then spin it. Tons of different ways to get that same effect, to do whatever you want it to. Splattering is a bit different. Splattering, I know I put these both in the same category, but it's basically ways to moisturize your paint and then have it do fun things based on motion of some kind, right? So the drips and splatters, you're going to be lifting your canvas, and the drips rather, and then the splatters are when you have a brush whose bristles are flat. Usually, some people actually like to use a toothbrush instead, and then you pull it back and you let it go, and it goes towards your canvas, and you get these cool splatters going on. So it creates a really fun, very messy effect. As you can see, it traveled all the way to my glazing box, which I guess we can do those soon, but it's still wet, so we're gonna wait a bit more. So yeah, the drips and splatters are just a fun way to add cool movement and texture using a bit of water. What do we got next? Drips and splatters, scumbling. Scumbling is when you make a circular motion to fill in your paint with your brush. It's more about the motion than anything else, but you might have scumbling and dry brush kind of in the same category, where you have your brush with paint and you're roughing it in. Okay? It's more about the motion of coloring something in, like that, roughly. You might do this as an underpainting, like you might actually just say, okay, this color, this area of the painting is scumbled in, right? And it's just roughed in. It's just like a way to lay down some color really quickly without detail, and giving it that rough texture that kind of looks like it was colored with a crayon or something. The only this isn't like super groundbreaking. The only reason I mention it is because I hear people say the word scumbling a lot when I read different art books. And really all they mean, scumbling and dry brush are very similar. But scumbling is just like, oh, like roughing it in. Like it's a fancy art way of saying it. Masking is kind of something that you can say, oh, I think I actually don't have anything nearby. Hang on. Okay, so masking is basically describing any technique you use to block paint from reaching the canvas in a planned way. So that could mean stencils. It could mean masking tape. It could mean masking fluid. So if you are a watercolorist, you may have seen masking fluid. I don't use it, but they do have pens that contain masking fluid, and then when you draw on your paper the areas that you want to be blocked from paint, and then that way later on after it dries you peel off the dried masking fluid, and it'll reveal the clean paper underneath after you've painted over it. So it acts like a stencil or a blocker. So in this case I'm just going to use masking tape. Again, you can either do this straight onto your canvas first, or you can paint a layer first, mask on top of that, and then paint another layer. And then you have like this effect where it will have different layers of colors with different levels of control. Okay, let's do some orange. We haven't done orange yet. So with masking, I would suggest using thicker paint, and I said that and I just went ahead and didn't, because you want it to not seep underneath your stencil. And another thing about acrylics is that you want to peel off the mask before it dries completely. Like, let it settle for a second, especially if it's a little more on the liquidy side. Then you can remove your mask after, but not too long. Because what happens with acrylic paint, if you've completely covered it with acrylic, acrylic when it dries, well, it's based in, it's water-based, but it has plastic in it, right? That's the actual acrylic paint. It's like the binder in acrylics act like a flexible plastic. So if you layer over an entire layer of paint, then let it dry completely, it'll actually make a film over everything and you risk lifting your stencil and all of the paint with it. Now, if you've ever cleaned a palette before that didn't have palette paper, mine has a paper underneath, but if you've ever noticed, if you put acrylic paint on a plastic plate, then you can peel off all of the paint after it dries and it all lifts up as one. So what I just wanted to emphasize is that when you do a stencil with acrylic, I'm going to use my little knife here, you want to pull up the stencil before it's dried completely so that you don't pull up all of your paint. There you go. But see how anywhere the tape was touching, there is now the white canvas underneath. Sometimes it helps to use an X-Acto knife or something. I don't know, my fingers can't always make it under that tape. Again, you can use a stencil. You can buy pre-made stencils. You can make your own stencil with an X-Acto knife and some cardstock. I would recommend not using just regular printer paper though, because it's a bit too soft. And painting on top of it, the water will make it break down. So painter's tape is perfect if you can get the right shapes. That's masking. Lots of fun. Tons of fun. If you let that dry and then do another layer of tape, and then you can expose other parts of it as well, it creates a cool effect. All right, what do we got next? Soft edge and hard edge. Soft edge and hard edge, I'll say versus. Soft edge and hard edge are just ways of describing the way you're using your brushwork. So a soft edge could be anything like the scumbling, the wet on wet, the dry brush edges here that are softer. And when I mean soft, I mean they don't have a very defined edge. So soft edge, you might be a bit gentler at the edges. I'm just like tapping my brush down, and I might use a bit of medium or water to soften the edges. And being a bit lighter, you might want to use like a fan brush or even a dry brush technique. I seem to have run out of brushes. It's any way you can do to create, here we go, soft, faded edges. That kind of transition. Like I said, dry brushing is a great way to blend because what it is doing is not adding, because it's a dry brush, it's not adding water or paint to the existing paint. What it's doing is it's manipulating existing paint to do things on the canvas without anything else interfering. So it's a very controlled way to move your, again, I'm all about controlling these paints and getting them to do what I tell them to. It's a very controlled way to get the paints to react a certain way. So soft edge is just that. You get it to spread out, to be nice and soft. Hard edge is more like a design, clean cut, sharp edge. So we're going to use black because I find that really accentuates it. Make sure your paint is not too dry. You need a mix, something pretty fluid, but not too chunky or watery either. So a medium. And I like to use a square edged brush. So here it's almost like calligraphy. Sorry, you can't actually see what I'm doing that. I'll do it from top to bottom so you can see what I just did. I'm using the edge of the brush to make that hard edge. It's kind of like a calligraphy brush. You don't need to use a calligraphy brush. You can use any brush really, but the ones with the flat edges tend to be the most obvious. It's the difference between a soft or faded edge, and I think I just covered all my soft edges with this, and a sharp, clean cut edge, okay? So that way when you have more vocabulary now to describe things you see in a painting, like, oh, look how they softened the edges of that house in that painting, or look how hard the edges of that furniture are, or the shapes in the face, you know, like look, you know, so this defines the nature of the mark itself. Next, we'll do blending, and we will get back to the wet the underpainting and the glazing. I just, this canvas paper, the paint pad, is extremely, it's very glossy. The finish on it is kind of smooth, so it doesn't readily absorb the paint as quickly. So I need to wait for that other stuff to dry. Alrighty, I think I'm gonna need more blue. I'm feeling like, oh no, I'm good, I have some. Okay, so blending is probably something I do the most of. I'm gonna grab a fair amount of paint. I'm scooping it up with my brush, okay? And I'm laying it down here. And you can see it has some texture. I'm flattening it out a bit. I'm gonna spread it down maybe halfway. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna grab a new color, grab some yellow, and I'm gonna blend the blue into the yellow. So blending can be the hardest thing for some people. What you're doing is you're transitioning from one color to the next by combining the paint on the canvas. And see, I'm just brushing at it. And the closer I get to the pure blue, the darker, like the more blue it is, and the less yellow is in there. And sometimes you have to go back, you have to clean your brush. Sometimes your paint dries too quickly. Blending can be extremely frustrating because sometimes the paint doesn't listen, right? So now I have a clean brush and I want to blend this greenish color closer to this darker green. So I'm just gonna dab at it like this. It's a process of constantly prodding and poking your paint to get it to mix with a color live on the canvas. See? So now you have a transition from blue to green. And that's basically blending. It's probably the technique I use the most, personally anyway, to get things to blend on the canvas. Some people, what they'll do is they will pre-mix the next color on their palette, and there's nothing wrong with that, okay? It's teach their own, really, because I prefer, personally, to blend right on the canvas because I know what it's gonna look like. When I grab a color from the palette that's pre-mixed and put it onto the canvas, sometimes I feel like pushing it around anyway. So some people like to pre-mix their color and have like a whole wide variety of pre-mixed colors so they don't have to do any mixing on the canvas. Again, it's all personal preference. Stipple, also referred to as dabbing. Oopsies. I messed up my B's. So now you have two random capitalized B's. For dabbing or stippling, I tend to like using a round brush. You can use any brush really to do anything, but sometimes it's just easier to do a different shape. I'll use like a rounded brush because then I like to play around with bouncing it around on the canvas, and that gives us a cool stippling effect. In this case, I'm gonna grab this color. It's like a pinky reddish color. And you just kind of go top down, bounce it around. And then you get some cool textures going on like that. I'm gonna mix a different color into there and you can see the effects. Boop, 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 boop. Just play around with different colors. It's basically a way you're not using the brush to blend. It's like the opposite of blending. You're applying the paint directly to the canvas in a kind of a bumping or hopping motion. Different ways to get different effects. Again, really cool for textures, maybe for some tree branches, that kind of thing. Next one I have radiating outwards. I also refer to it as a glow. Now for this, I like to go from light to dark, and it's a way to describe a blending method that I use for lighting effects. Now, in this case, I need some white. In this case, I'm going to start with white, and then I'm going to go outwards to make the white look like it's a glowing dot of light. You can use this for this is handy when you're doing like a moon or a sun. Basically, I'll start with white, and you can't really see it too much just yet. And then what I'll do is I'll progressively add a little bit more pigment in a very controlled, slow way around that point. that's where the radiating comes in. The radiating means it's coming out, it's flowing from the inside, and it's radiating outwards. A light, a kind of a pinprick of light. And we'll add a little bit more pigment with every ring around this circle. I use this method a lot when I'm trying to describe a 3D object that might have a highlight on it, maybe a toy, or maybe a bright light in the sky. You can see it starts to look a bit like a sun or a moon, or maybe a star. And you progressively add darker and darker rings around it with less and less white, or whatever your highlight color was. You can do this with any colors. It doesn't have to be white. That's not the rule. The rule for radiating or glowing is just a progressive ring of darker colors as you go outwards. Now, if you're like me, seeing the different stages bugs me. I like to have everything blended smoothly. That's probably the digital artist in me when I would use, gradients or airbrushing. So what I do is I clean my brush, I dry it off, and then I can touch up the edges by gently pushing the two colors together. This is another method for blending. So these radiating, glow, and blending are kind of cousins, or rather this is the technique and this is a different way to use it. Just don't mix, I'm cleaning my brush in between. Don't mix stages without cleaning your brushes in between, or else you're going to pull this dark color into your lighter ring area. You can even go back and add a bit of white to your brush to do more blending. You can add a bit of water, whatever helps you get that look that it's like really glowing from within. This fun one is double load. It can be double or triple or quadruple, depending on how big your brush is. Basically, it's a technique where you are going to apply more than one color at the same time using one tool. You're loading up the one tool twice or more, but we're going to stick with two for now because my brush isn't that big. Sometimes it's harder to actually just load it up, but I'm going to do blue on one side and let's use some more red. I think I've run out. Hang on, let me just grab some more red. Okay. So I have blue on one side. I'm going to flip the brush over and do red on the other side. So now you can see I have this two-toned brush. Then you can see what it does. It's one single stroke and they follow each other. And it can make a cool effect. Like that. You can reload it the same way. And it can make some neat effects. Now I even didn't have any paint right in the middle, so I even got that little white stripe in there. But basically it's all one brush stroke. So what's interesting about this method is that you're only getting the marking, like the evidence of one brush being used, but there is more than one color. Okay. Last one, and before we go back to the ones that had to dry, outlining or drawing basically is what I use when I put the slash here. It's just another way of saying it. It's either outlining or drawing. It's very similar to what I was demonstrating with the hard edge. It's basically a way to draw with your paint. So I like to use a sharper brush, but basically it's just the description of using your brush like a pencil to draw or outline something. So you can use it to make really fine lines, but in this case you're doing outlines instead of filling in areas of color. You're using it like a drawing tool. And I'll often do this when I'm trying to sketch in a painting, like we did one the other day. What was it? We did some drawing with paint the other day. I did this jar. And this jar was done with a round brush, and I did a black and white. I just used black paint with a bit of water, and I was using my brush like a pen or a pencil to sketch. So again, I have a brush here. It's got some paint on it and a little bit of paint and a lot of water, and you might use it to sketch something out, right? Before you apply your final layer of paint. So it's just a way to describe using your brush as a drawing tool instead of using it as a regular paintbrush to apply paints. Okay, so for the last two, I'm gonna go over it quickly. Glazing is something where you have, we're gonna jump back to glazing, where you have this layer here, and you're going to progressively add more layers on top. I'm gonna choose white, watered down white. It's probably the best way to show the effects of it. And I'm adding a layer on top that shows the underlayer. I want the blue underneath to still show. So I'm going to water down my paint. You can also use a medium for this. Glazing is a way to describe adding more layers to a painting that you work on, you let it dry in between sessions, okay? So you might want to shade something, let that dry, and then add another layer. But the idea is that you want this underlayer to show. That's simply a way to describe, like, you have your base layer and it's gonna show at the end. You want it to show. Okay, and then you're adding consecutive layers of watered down or watered down paint on top, or translucent paint. I can go on forever about translucent paints. Different paints have different levels of opacity. Like this one is has a little square that you can't see because it's way too small and not focusing. There's a little, sometimes your things of paint will have an indicator of how opaque your paint is, and it's normally described with a square that is fully colored in, partially colored in, or completely empty, describing how transparent the paint is. Another way to test it is if you have like writing here, and then I know my yellow for a fact is very translucent. It's a very translucent paint. And I know that when I paint over it, I can still see underneath. So using semi-transparent paints are a good way to do glazing as well. Typically white is not transparent, which is why I watered it down to show you the glazing. All right, so two more. Underpainting, like I said, this is like the rough layer. And what I want to do on top is when I use the term underpainting when the bottom layer is the sketch, and then I plan on very intentionally afterwards covering the sketch with different colors, like so. I don't intend for the underpainting to show. That's why it's called an underpainting, okay? You're doing it on purpose to guide you. And sometimes evidence of your underpainting will show, but it's not done in a way like glazing where you're trying to emphasize that bottom layer. You're actually covering it when you're doing an underpainting. The underpainting is meant to be covered at the end. Beautiful. All right, the last one we did was the modeling paste, which is still not dry. So I'm not gonna paint over my modeling paste here. I'm gonna cheat and I'm gonna show you one that I did yesterday. So this modeling paste has had time to dry, okay? It even has some really beautiful detail, which you won't see because oh, look, it focused, yay! It has some cracks. Do you see those cracks? Some people really love that stuff. I say some people because I'm not one of them. It's not that I don't like it, it's just that normally my painting style is very detailed and finished and smooth. But some people love this texture, and then you go at it with your brush. You can add any color to it, you can add glitter to it, you can do whatever you want. But now it's as if I painted this modeling paste square with really thick magenta paint. See that texture? It's like a mountain. You can get some really cool stuff with modeling paste. You can intentionally sculpt it, make your paintings look 3D without making them 3D with your paint, because that takes a lot of paint and you don't want that. Sorry, I smacked my mic with the canvas. And there you have it, all 18 techniques. Yeah, so for more, just comment or message me, or however. You can find my stuff at kinainc.com. If you have questions or want the actual written documentation description for all of these, just let me know. Happy painting!